What's up? What's good today is we have a person from Asian Americans for, remind me again, Chris, Asian American for
Advancing Justice.
Advancing Justice here today. He's going to be talking about ways that we could still get involved in the voting process, and going to be talking about the important knowledge on voting. This is going to be recorded because I know that most of our campus has a lot of Zoom meetings or Zoom related festivities happening. So this is going to be recorded and will be available on our ASSC YouTube. So please share this information so that we are well prepared for November 3rd and for the rest of our civically engaged future, right? So it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Christopher Chen, who we have been working with on this voter initiative, part of our voting programming. And it's great to have somebody who looks like the youth to talk about youth-related things, right? Because a lot of the folks that we've been having come in are like a lot of adults. So it's great to have somebody else who just graduated college 2 years ago, right? So he knows the journey that y'all will be a part of. So please, give a warm round of applause, virtual applause. Of course, it's the ring to our presenter, Christopher Chen. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much again to Alvin and Ryan at the Center for Student Life for just inviting me to share a little bit more about how to vote in this upcoming and really just to get to meet all of them. I was telling them before we started that I was super excited to be working again with youth, again, showing my age, only graduating about 2 years ago, but still really passionate to be connecting with young people. So let's see, I think Alvin and Ryan, if there's any questions that come up with the Padlet, if you could just throughout, but I'd be happy to take any questions. Also starting any polls, let's just see. I'm gonna start the, So sorry, Ryan, I'm gonna share, I made a second Slido that I'm gonna share in the chat. I didn't realize that it was not the same one that we had originally shared, but I'm gonna send this one here to folks because I do have some, I did have some polls. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone.
You're good, no worries.
Yeah, I think we can just do the polls via the chat then. So I think just starting off the presentation to just pull out the room real fast and see who here has voted already in this upcoming election. If you have, just share maybe yes, I have, or no, I haven't, but I'm planning to. If you're a little confused about whether or not you want to vote or not. Cool, I'm seeing some yeses. Just trying to do some fielding. That's awesome. I'm loving all the enthusiasm. Most of this presentation will be extra for y'all. Cool, thinking about ways to do outreach outside of just the regular scope of voting. But that's great. Cool. So just a little bit for introductions. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris, pronouns he, him, his, and I am the Voting Rights Community Advocate at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus. So specifically, Asian Law Caucus is the oldest legal and civil rights organization for Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. We do a variety of different work surrounding immigrant rights, casework surrounding criminal justice reform, housing, We also do workers' rights, and we also have our voting rights and census team, which is the one that I work on. And really the goal for us as an organization or us as a team is to be pursuing equity. We are here to reduce barriers that would impede communities of color or marginalized communities from accessing democracy or accessing the systems of justice that we interact with. So very excited to be working with the organization and excited to be speaking with all of you today. So a couple of the main objectives that I wanted to cover in this presentation, we're going to be going over a little bit of voting history and voting suppression. I will try to make it as engaging as possible to be working over a little bit of history. I'm also going to be covering a little bit of the importance of the youth vote, so specifically why it's important for all of us as young people to be voting. And finally, a little bit of more technical information, the different ways to cast a ballot in this election. And again, if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or feel free to add it to the Padlet attached. So I like to start our conversation of the history of voter suppression really at its source. So maybe even just opening it up for the room, does anyone know when the first instance of voting occurred in the United States? And it's fine that we're doing it virtually. If you don't know, it actually was in 1776. And this was actually very specific. It actually limited a lot of Americans at the time because the right to vote was originally conceived to be only US white-born male landowners. Actually, I think the statistics for this first presidential election, only 6% of the population was actually allowed to vote during this time. I can't really see many people's faces on this call right now, but just looking between me, Alvin, and Ryan, none of us would have been able to vote at the time, which really goes to show the frameworking or how our country has started the process of voting, where we began. In 1790, this was actually expanded to specifically white immigrants, but again, only men. So the next couple examples that I wanted to go over are instances of more voter suppression and voter intimidation, making the distinction that you do not necessarily have access to the right to vote, even if you do have the legal right to vote. And one of the best examples for this is actually after the Mexican-American War. This was in 1848 after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which naturalized a large subset of California, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona to become part of the United States. And at the time, the treaty actually gave the Mexican citizens who were assimilating to America the right to vote. So all male Mexican immigrants were actually naturalized and given that right to vote. But in actuality, we see that their access to being able to actually cast their ballot was something that wasn't necessarily correlating. We see all of the language materials were actually only provided in English. This was a stark, great example of how voter suppression of language access curbs one's ability to cast their ballot. So even though there was a large subsection of immigrants who had the right to vote, that didn't necessarily mean different communities could vote. The next example that we like to bring up is back in, I believe, 1870, right after the 15th Amendment and the Civil War. So after the North won and the 15th Amendment was ratified, Black men were given the right to vote. And I think in our education system, we are really pubbed this narrative of the picture on the left, that free Black men were allowed to freely just cast their ballot without any repercussions. And this is something that our education system has done to really whitewash our perception of history. The reality is more the picture on the right, where we see a free Black man is being held at gunpoint for whether he's casting a ballot that did not correspond with the opinions of other folks around him, or even just casting his ballot at all. This is something that we really see as like the Jim Crow laws, like having literacy tests, having expectations of you having to read and write in English in order to prove that you can vote, or prove your credibility of voting. The next victory that I wanted to uplift on our trip down memory lane for history is in 1920, the women's suffrage movement actually allowed for women, a large subset of women, to achieve the right to vote. So this was the 19th Amendment after it was ratified. I did want to clarify one thing when it comes down to talking about women's rights with voting. This did not actually apply to all women. And before on to the next slide, if anyone does know, I'd be interested to know if anyone knew this, but there is actually a large subsection of the population that did not have the right to vote, both male and female. So for anyone who didn't know, being the Asian Law Caucus, Asian immigrants were actually one of the last communities to be able to really access this right to vote. For any folks who are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which started in the late 1800s and was finally repealed in 1943. This specific policy kept out all Asian immigrants, specifically Chinese immigrants, from coming to the United States. And this has been a large history of how policy impacts immigration, impacts the way that we socially relate to each other, like the gendered stereotypes of Asian Americans. So this piece of policy not only contributed to that, but also curbed the legal right to vote for a lot of folks. It wasn't until 2 years later that both Indian and Filipino Americans were actually given the right to vote. And then it wasn't until 1952 that all Asian American communities were given this right as well. So if we think back to Mexican Americans being given the legal right to vote back in 1848, it wasn't almost like a century later that Asian immigrants were given this right as well. It's also important to recognize that even at this point, there is no talk about language access at all. So for the most part, communities of color are still kept out of this bubble or kept out of this loop of accessing their vote. The next victory that I wanted to highlight, if not the biggest victory, is actually in 1965, which was the Voting Rights Act. And this is the culmination, the product of the civil rights movement. It was primarily to the gratitude of all the hard work and emotional labor of the Black community. And this specific act was a way to topple down the pre-mentioned Jim Crow laws, to topple down all of the literacy tests, the ways that folks were impeding communities of color from accessing their right to vote. So definitely a hallmark pass in voting rights protection. We can thank the Voting Rights Act for protecting like electioneering near polling places. So if you go to a polling place, you're not allowed to wear any overt materials that would sway someone towards like voting a certain way. We can thank that for the Voting Rights Act. And it doesn't stop there actually. So in 1975, about 10 years later, this Congresswoman, Barbara Jordan from Texas, recognized that there was still a large part of voting rights accessibility that was missing from the Voting Rights Act. So during her time as a Congresswoman, she actually extended the Voting Rights Act to end discrimination against language minorities. So if we were to look at any vote center or any polling location nowadays, we see signs like that are translated in multiple languages. We see ballots that folks can vote in their preferred language or a language that is not English. All of this can actually be thanked by Barbara Jordan, because she was the original person who recognized that, again, like language access is a significant barrier in impacting someone's ability to understand the voting of an election. So at the end of the day, thank you for going through a little bit of history with me. I guess the key takeaway is, again, people fought for our vote. I think it's important to recognize how recent the actual process of voting has been, specifically across people of color and communities of color. And so recognizing the struggle and recognizing the barriers that people have fought against to ensure that we do have the right to vote, I would significantly urge us to be executing that right. I think a large part of who we are as the Asian Law Caucus is recognizing that civic engagement does not end just at Election Day. And I think that it is totally valid for folks to be disillusioned with the weight that a vote can have, but also important to recognize that it is one of the many tools that we have in trying to see the change that we want, trying to be the change we want to see in our communities. So the next slide that I wanted to talk about, I'm going to pivot a little bit more on the importance of the youth vote. So this figure here is actually from the 2018 election. This was supplied by the University of Southern California. The California Civic Engagement Project provided a lot of details. I've linked the report below. But essentially, this is the demographics of who turned out to vote in the 2018 election. And if you see to the farthest left side of the graph, the demographics of 18 to 24-year-olds are by far the lowest voter turnout rate across all other age groups. And this is important because it really shows us how our education system is just very, very disillusioned of being able to plug us into why voting is important or why it's important for young people to express our rights to vote. We could also talk about a little later if anyone has questions, but we can also talk about how our society is not structured in a way that's conducive for students to be able to vote, or the way that everyone has so many priorities in life that voting doesn't seem to be as important. But if we actually look at the numbers, specifically the total amount of 18 to 24-year-olds who are eligible to vote, more than 2 out of 3 young people did not vote in the last election, which is a significant number when you think it's only 1 in 3 people who are really voting. So just imagining the potential that we have to really be the change we want to see in our communities, to be sharing our political voice. One aspect to, I guess the cyclical argument for why folks don't want to vote is because they feel that politicians are not listening to them. And I think recognizing that it is to an extent a matter of capitalism and having to provide the numbers and provide the voter turnout, but decision makers are more likely to respond to people who are voting than people who are within their own communities. So it is, again, a way for us to share our political voice. This more general slide is another way to show, I guess, a little bit more of intersectionality, that across total populations, which primarily include white communities, white voter turnout is significantly higher than that of Asian American and Latinx voter turnout. So wanting to recognize that as people of color, it's important for us to be turning out to vote as well, because our participation rates are statistically lower than other communities. So after talking a little bit more about why it's important to vote, I think right now we can pivot a little bit more to how we can envision to see ourselves voting in this upcoming election. I've actually been able to tailor this slide or these slides to specifically San Mateo County. But if you were planning to vote in any other county besides that, for whatever reason, feel free to message me afterwards or to ask in the chat, and I can share some resources specifically for other counties. So seeing are the Asian Law Caucus. A couple of these slides are going to be a little technical, because the legal field is a mess. But please bear with me if anything gets too inaccessible. So a couple of notes for being able to vote. To vote in this election, you can vote if you are a US citizen, a resident of California, 18 years or older on election day, not currently in prison or on parole for a conviction of a felony, and by a court to be mentally incompetent. Specifically for youth, you can actually pre-register if you are 16 or 17. And also on the ballot this year, there are additional measures to help increase the ability of youth to vote, specifically in primaries. So if you are passionate about the youth vote, like there are definitely ways that you can vote towards propositions to increase voter accessibility. So the first step is to obviously register to vote. For folks who are unsure of what registering to vote is, it's essentially signing up to vote in an election. It is ensuring that the registrar of voters has your name down and can send you specific information. So one important note is that the registration deadline for San Mateo County and for the rest of California was actually last Monday. It was October 19th. And this date is significant because it's basically the last day that the registrar of voters can assure you that they will be able to send a written ballot in the mail for you to mail back. I did want to note that if you did miss this deadline, you can still register and vote. You can participate in what we call same-day voter registration. So thankfully, California actually has some pretty good voter protection laws. We actually allow for what we call same-day voter registration so that no one will be shut out from voting because they missed a deadline or because they missed like a calendar day. What this essentially is you will go in person to vote either during early voting or on election day. You will just have to fill out a separate registration form. They'll put your ballot in a separate pile and they will check to make sure that you actually are registered or do live in San Mateo County before counting your ballot. A couple misconceptions are that these ballots are not counted unless it's like a tight race. That is completely false. Your vote definitely will matter and will be counted regardless of how close the results look. So the next step in getting ready to vote is to be prepared. The primary element that the Asian Law Caucus really wants to is to educate yourself. So before Election Day, earlier this October, the state and the county should have sent every single registered voter information about the candidates and the different propositions. I'm sure based on everyone else here on this call, I'm assuming that everyone has received propaganda and all sorts of political ads or across the last couple of weeks. And I know it can definitely be draining. It can definitely be gaslighty. It can be something that just like is supposed to evoke emotion. And of which side you sit on. The Asian Law Caucus really does like to push for nonpartisan information. We specifically use the tool Voters Edge, which I have linked in the Padlet. But essentially what you can do is you can write down your own address and it will specifically show which candidates and which propositions are going to be on your ballot. And this is a great way just to get the facts and less about opinions specific to an election. The next aspect of getting prepared is to recognize different accessibility of language. So a couple of things about San Mateo County specifically, thanks to Barbara Jordan and thanks to translatable materials, Chinese and Spanish are the two languages that San Mateo County is providing all resources for. So this means that all signs, all how to fill out your ballot, the actual ballots themselves will be translated into these different materials. It means if you know anyone who wishes to vote in Chinese or in Spanish, they will have the option to do so. There's also different tiers of language access, which is one of the frustrating things when it comes to like voter information. So actually, if you do not fall within your preferred language being Chinese or Spanish, but you do wish to vote in either Burmese, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, or Tagalog, there actually will be translated reference ballots available. And what these are, it's essentially a second sheet that will be in whatever corresponding language. And it will be a direct copy of your English ballot. You actually cannot vote on these. You can't vote in Tagalog in San Mateo County, but you will have a guide, a little takeaway that you can bring into the vote center to be able to fill out your ballot. One thing that you do need to make sure, more so for vote by mail, is to make sure that your county knows your preferred language. So I know that the deadlines are probably very close. So actually tomorrow is the last day that you can request a translated reference ballot in the mail in San Mateo County. But if that is still something that you are interested in, you can contact your county's elections office at this number here, or you can go online to change your preferred language. I think the catch-all is always to contact the county office to make sure that things being set locally. You can always reach out to the Secretary of State or like the state website, but that oversees all of the state and not specifically San Mateo County. So working locally is always better. The last part of getting ready to vote is to make a plan of knowing how and where you're going to vote. So this is also a good time for folks to look at the list of vote centers to see where I want to cast my ballot or how I want to cast my ballot. And before I jump into step 3, I wanted to just do a quick temperature check. How are folks feeling right now? Any questions? Any reflections?
There's one question, Chris. I got one question from the Slido.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what kind of mechanism is put in place to ensure the accuracy of voting turnout?
Ensure the accuracy of voting turnout. I did want to make a clarification. Is there, when you're referring to accuracy of voting turnout, are you referring to voting fraud? Like tracking a person's, like the county being able to track to see if folks are voting more than once? Or are you referring to voter turnout accuracy of like recording how many people are voting? If it's the former, then technically for all ballots, you are provided an ID number, and that is linked to a system through the Registrar of Voters. So I think actually like the studies for voter fraud, it comes down to like less than 1% of all ballots have ever actually been found like confirmed as voter fraud. And it's something that is very fear-mongering, something that folks are very quick to be like, oh, like what if folks are trying to manipulate elections that way? And the actual physical data hasn't shown anything close to that. Having sat on different meetings with like the ROV for San Mateo County, I can say that all of these databases are not linked to the cloud. So if we think about like the voter registration lists or the list of who is actually voted, they're not linked to the internet, and we have been reassured by these county registrars that it's impossible to hack into these systems. Did that happen to answer the question?
Possibly. I do have another one on the same note as voter fraud. Chris, I have been hearing a lot of people talk about mail-in voting not being um, trustworthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of been like the thing that I've been hearing. Would you help us understand like where does that come from, and could you demystify?
Yeah, sure. I think mm, if we're talking about the safety of voting by mail, I did want to reassure folks that we have been voting by mail for many elections prior to this. When we think about like the system of mail-in voting, um, we think about like what we've done in the past, which is essentially absentee ballot. So essentially, absentee ballots work by everyone who is registered can check a box to say, I would like my ballot mailed to me. And in order for that person to receive a ballot in the mail, they have to have registered. So I feel like there's a lot of fear mongering going around with people saying like, oh, like everyone's going to receive a ballot, like even if they didn't like request it. And like, that's going to be easy to like fake votes or like fake like numbers and stuff. But the, the registrar of voters is still only going to send ballots to people who are registered to vote. So it's the difference. I feel like it's the same process. Like you either register to vote and you click a box that says like I want an absentee ballot, and this is before these are like all the elections prior. But in this specific election, it's you don't need to check a box. Everybody is going to be sent a ballot. If you do vote on the ballot that was to you, and then you show up in person to vote, your ID on the ballot that you mailed in respond to your specific ID of voting in person. And there will be a discrepancy. It'll be like, well, you've already submitted a ballot. So that's also an element of like voter fraud. I've been reassured that our counties are sufficient enough to know that people who are mailing in will have a check mark or some kind of distinction to know that they have already voted by mail, and thus voting like in person would be a form of voter fraud. Does
Thank you.
that answer the question?
Yes. Thank
Cool, cool. Yeah, and I think I can get into a little bit more of like the steps of voting right now, but I again would be happy to take any questions in a little bit too. I think we have about maybe just a little bit more worth of content left. But thank you so much for the questions. So specifically for this election, there are three main buckets of voting. There is a fourth, which I can talk about at the end if there is interest, but for the sake of simplicity or for the sake of the majority of folks who will be voting in this election, we do like to address like three main ways that people can vote. So the first one is obviously voting from home. I think a lot of us have already received ballots in the mail with a large set of like candidates and propositions and stuff. And I know a lot of us have already, but just for anyone who hasn't, a couple tips for returning your ballot. You need to make sure that you sign and date your return envelope. That is the number one reason for why ballots are invalidated, that there was no signature. You do need to make sure that the signature matches the one that you used on your official registration. And for most people, that means the signature that you used for your driver's license, because the state is partnering with the DMV to ensure signature verification that way. One aspect that you can implement to ensure that you are watching your ballot or making sure that there's no fraud with like the mail-in system or the Dropbox system. You can track your ballot online. Each ballot is again assigned an ID number. You can go to this free service to track your ballot. So you will see it like being collected. You can see it in transit to the actual registrar of voters office, and then you can see if it's counted. A couple notes, because I know that like there have been crazy things that have been happening all across the state. So I think specifically in Southern California last week, there was an instance of someone like setting a Dropbox on fire and like invalidating like all of the ballots that were in that Dropbox at that time. So being the concerned nonprofit worker that I have been sitting in with all the different ROVs to ask them like, what is your contingency plan if this were to happen? Essentially, there will be a PSA for anybody who delivered their ballot during like this time frame at this location. And the registrar of voters has assured me that they will be working tirelessly to get you a second ballot or to make sure that you can vote in person. So government being a thankless job, recognizing that there are a lot of hardworking people, specifically in San Mateo, that I've grown quite close with, who are trying to make sure that all of us have access to a fair and protected voting system. Other elements of returning your ballot or voting by mail, you want to make sure that you're using blue or black ink. If you do make a mistake, you can cross it out with an X or draw a line through the incorrect selection. At this point, it's kind of too late almost to request a new ballot. So just make sure that you're making it clear what your selection is. I've been told that the ballots are essentially Scantron, like we're all used to on our wonderful like SATs or like standardized testing. But if there is a issue with the Scantron, then someone will be looking over by eye. So as long as it's clear what your original selection, what your correct selection is, and there shouldn't be a problem with counting your ballot. In terms of returning, you can return your signed ballot to any post office or USPS mailbox. For any Dropbox location or for any voting location, you can look on to your specific county's details. So there should be a link that I've put in these slides to show where all the Dropboxes are and where all the voting locations will be. Dropboxes are an addition to like voting locations. They're a separate entity, like you won't be able to talk to one regarding your, but if you go to a voting location, you also will be able to drop off your ballot. So you kind of have like two options in that way. Timeline wise, your ballot must be postmarked by Tuesday, November 3rd, or returned to a Dropbox by 8 p.m. on election day. And one thing is you do not have to pay for postage. You don't have to worry about like having enough money to get your ballot in. You do need to put it in the original envelope or the correct envelope that was sent to you. And that's another way that ballots are actually invalidated. And one more distinction, if you are planning to mail your ballot, we ask that you mail it before election day because the distinction is it needs to be postmarked by November 3rd. So you can drop it in a box and it could not, and if that specific box isn't going to be picked up until the next day, then your vote will not count. So if it is November 3rd, we recommend you just go straight to a Dropbox or a voting location to drop it off. A couple benefits from voting from home, you have flexibility. You can fill out your ballot whenever you want. You can receive help from your families and friends, and you can vote in the comfort of your own home. You don't have to worry about standing in line. And there is more time for you to research and prepare for answering your ballot. The second form of voting, which is very similar to the first, we just want to make the distinction that you can mail in your ballot and then you can also drop it off at a Dropbox. So again, if you are unsure about the post system, which we have been assured is definitely safe, for some reason, if you want it to be in through the system quicker, you can drop it off at a Dropbox. For San Mateo County specifically, there are over 35 different locations. Again, does not require mailing, it's contactless, and you can track your ballots that were dropped off in a Dropbox. So I actually live in Santa Clara County, and I dropped mine off in a Dropbox about like a week and a half ago, and I think I received an email saying that like your ballot has been received. So if you're still interested in those tracking opportunities, they do exist for drop boxes. So for all Dropbox locations, you can go to this link below, and it also have like specific hours. San Mateo County is good because I think most of the drop boxes are 24 hours. So you don't have to worry about like coming within like business hours to do your ballot drop off. So the final way that you can actually vote is to vote in person. Surprise, just like we are all used to. I know that for a lot of young folks, this might not be something that's as important, but one distinction for this election and for future elections, so San Mateo County is actually part of what we call a VCA county, or a Voters Choice Act county. It's a way to, again, reduce voter suppression and to increase voter accessibility. So before, actually in California, you were assigned a specific place, usually the one closest to your house, and you had to vote in that location. But now, for this election and for future elections, for San Mateo County specifically, you can go to any vote center and vote in any of the locations across the county. And this is a way for folks to be able to access their right to vote if they are working on the other side of town and they are working 2 shifts, and it's, you know, it's hard for them to go all the way back home just to cast their ballot. This is definitely like a good way to increase accessibility in that way. So if you were to vote in person, there are over 45 different vote centers available. You will walk in, find the main table, and provide your name and address. And then they will give you a ballot. The poll workers will give you a ballot and direct you to the voting booth. At this stage, it's important to recognize or important to make sure that your ballot is in your preferred language. So just a little bit of logistics from San Mateo County. Here are all the vote center hours and all the different locations. I actually did see that one of the locations is actually at Skyline College. So for anyone who lives close by, that is also like a good general reminder or a location that would be memorable. A couple other tips for voting in person. If you do need assistance, you can bring up to 2 people to help you vote, as long as they don't represent your employer or your union. So this is a great way to bring a family member or bring a friend. Or if you have, say, like a family member, like an uncle or that doesn't feel comfortable voting in, or doesn't have or does not fall within the translated materials languages provided in San Mateo County, you can bring someone who speaks your preferred language and they can help translate for you. You don't need to worry about citizenship. You don't need to worry about identification. It is part of your right as a voter to be able to bring up to 2 people to help you. Couple other tips for voting in person. You can always ask for help when voting. If you make a mistake, you don't have to worry about that being your only ballot. You can ask for a new one from the poll workers. And this kind of addresses like the 4th bucket, but there is assistance for people with different disabilities. So for voting, hearing, and mobility, or if there's any like ADA compliance issues, there should be some specifications for those communities. And I'd be happy to talk about that too later in detail if there's any questions. In terms of voting during COVID, we also want to reassure folks that vote centers will be set up to allow for physical distancing. Vote center workers are required to wear masks and to follow public health guidelines, and voters will be asked to comply with state and local health requirements. So I think for Santa Clara County, I've been told there's like one-use stylusing, or there are like the touchscreens will be cleaned before and after every single voter coming in. Pretty standard across the rest of California. So ensuring that even though it is quote unquote the safest way to vote, mail or by box. We don't want to discourage people from feeling comfortable voting in person. Other form of voter suppression is not having someone to be able to explain something. For POC communities, having difficulty like navigating the technological divide. We want to be able to reaffirm that voting in person is definitely a valid way to vote and will be safe. A couple flags to think about for the problems with voting, or if you do encounter any problems, be sure to just ask a vote center to check all their registration lists again. If for some reason you are not on the list to vote, you can again do same-day voter registration. So please just don't leave without voting. It can be frustrating, but you do have that legal right to. And again, that is a form of voter suppression, like keeping someone from like feeling like it's worth the effort of voting. It's something so easy to like manipulate like communities from not accessing like their right to political voice. Again, if you need to vote same-day registration, you just need to fill out like an additional form and it will be checked before your vote is actually counted. As part of the ALC and as part of other national missions, we do offer the following hotlines, which will provide like in-language assistance to anybody who has any questions when they're voting. And a couple things that I wanted to share again, like just key dates for San Mateo County specifically. So ballot drop boxes have already been opened. The official date to register was October 19th, but again, you still have that same day registration option. Day to request a translated reference ballot is tomorrow, so please do so if you are still intending to vote by mail. Early voting has already started for San Mateo County. There are a couple mobile sites actually, as well as I believe like 3 sites that are open that are sedentary. And again, election day is next Tuesday, and the polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And with that, thank you for your time. I see that we do have another question, but would be happy to just open the floor out and just hear anything that anybody has, like in terms of questions. To what capacity can I be engaged in civics as a non-citizen immigrant? This is a great question because I think a lot of our community members aren't necessarily citizens. So I think in the Padlet that I had shared, there are a couple of things that folks can do to help support elections as a non-citizen. So at this point, the biggest way that you can get involved is actually, I'm going to link it in the Zoom meeting. But we should have a sign up for a phone bank. So specifically with our national, we're doing phone banking to swing states, specifically Asian American voters in swing states. So like Georgia or Texas, it's a great way to impact like the federal election, because I think a lot of folks get disillusioned, like I'm in California, there's nothing I can do to help like sway another state to vote. So you can actually sign up for a training, sign up to learn how to talk to people about their voting rights, and to call folks and be able to share like, these are the important dates, these are what you have the right to. And it's a good way for folks to share information. You don't have to be a citizen to do so. You don't have to be a registered voter. You can be younger than 18. Anyone can phone bank. And that's always a great way. For future elections, you can also poll monitor. We actually do have a robust poll monitoring program. Unfortunately, our signups closed about 2 weeks ago. But for the Asian Law Caucus, we actually are overseeing over 300 volunteers for this upcoming election, and they'll be shipped out to across like 11 different counties. both this upcoming Saturday and next Tuesday. So maybe keeping eyes open for ways to get involved with future elections. You can also impact like your friends who are citizens, you know, talk to them about like, why are you voting? What's important to you about voting? What propositions speak out to you? That's always a good way to like, you know, advocacy or being able to explain to folks like why it's important to vote. Yeah, I hope that helps with the question. Are there any others? I know that we're approaching time, but I'd love to stay on for like a few more minutes if possible. But yeah, if there are no other questions, be happy to turn it back to Alvin.
I do have one question, Chris,
Mhm.
and this is kind of like a not a voting, well, kind of like voting thing, but like, could you help us understand why you're so passionate to do this work, being as someone young as you are? Like, yeah,
As someone as, I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part again?
as someone as young as you are, right? Because what's been going on is like, you know, a lot of what I've been seeing is there is that youth, energy that is happening in terms of our elections. For me, I would want to know like, when was that point for you to commit to doing this work?
Yeah, sure. Um, I think if there ever was like a moment that I was impassioned to start thinking about um, civic engagement or the importance of just like civic duty. Um, After the 2016 elections, I was a sophomore at the time, like sophomore. Um, and I just remember staying up. I was on the East Coast at the time, and I had stayed up to like 3 to watch like the results of the election. And I think that that was just a point which like from a nonpartisan perspective, I don't think it was necessarily like the outcome of the election. It was more me recognizing um, what are the ways that we can get involved, because I think we we really focus on like election day being like the time to like cast your ballot and to share your voice. But I think that it's like all integrated together. Like it is how we are presenting ourselves the other 364 days a year. Like, are we showing up to city council meetings? Are we showing up to like local rallies, or are we signing petitions to get like prospective legislation onto ballots? Who are making these decisions? I think for me, I was a political economy major in college, and I think I always like naturally had that affinity for like what was happening around me. But I think like also a very simple element is that there are a lot of people who are hurting in this country, and I think that if if we take a moment to just think about how we can best support them or how we can support other people around us, then thinking about all of them more naturally.
Thank
Awesome, awesome. Um, Yeah, and again, if there are any questions, I will link the slides in the Padlet that Alvin and Brian had shared, and in those slides are my contact information. If you ever want to reach out, or if you do have additional questions, be happy to provide that information as well. But apart from that, thank you again to Ryan and Alvin for presenting me with this opportunity to speak with y'all.